Y'all sound really good. It's nice to sing with you. I always, before going to lead worship at a new church for the first time, I ask, in this case, I ask Karen, like, what's it like? Do they laugh? Do they make noise? Like, yes, amen, any of that? And before coming out to Colorado about a year and a half ago now, I served in co-ministry with my wife, Reverend Terry, who's also a UU minister, and I think gonna come here later this spring, at a church on the south side of Chicago. So I'm used to people making noise. I'm not used to the very staid, quiet Unitarians who experience no emotion. Not used to that anymore. In Chicago, whole long stretches of the lakefront, because the whole city's right up against the lake, whole long stretches of the lakefront are just concrete walls. I mean, literally, to prevent erosion, you got a concrete wall, and it goes back a little, and you got a higher concrete wall, and it goes back a little. If you're lucky, you got a third concrete wall, and that's the lakefront. Sitting there once, watching the lake, I saw this optical illusion that didn't make sense to me at first. I saw these waves coming in towards me, sitting on this concrete wall, and then I also saw waves going back out again, which of course is just that I'm used to seashores where the waves come in and that's sort of the end of the story, but the waves were bouncing off the wall, just like the echo of my voice is bouncing off the back wall of this room and coming back again. I was watching this happen, wondering how far off into the middle of Lake Michigan did these things still go? How far did that wave bounce back? They did not bounce as far as the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific. The Marshall Islands are 3,000 miles northwest of Australia, and they were settled 4 millennia ago by people who traveled there in canoes across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The journalist Kim Tingley, in this marvelous article called Secrets of the Wave Riders, writes about the Marshall Islands, writes about what it is to navigate in those islands. They say 70 square miles of land. That's it. That's the whole Marshall Islands. 70 square miles of land. 5 islands, 29 atolls, rings of coral islets that grew up around the rims of underwater volcanoes, now encircle gentle lagoons. These little green dots and donuts make up 2 parallel, more or less north-south island chains, separated from their nearest neighbor by 100 miles or more on average. And the thing is that swells, these giant ocean waves, these ocean crossing waves, swells generated by distant storms in Alaska, Antarctica, California, Indonesia, they travel thousands of miles across open ocean to these little spits of low-lying land. And when they hit, part of their energy is reflected back out to sea again in arcs, just like I saw on that concrete wall in Chicago. It's reflected back out again, and then another part of it sort of curls around the island or atoll and makes this chop in its wake. Wave piloting, wave navigating is the art of reading by sight and by feel these patterns in the waves, of feeling the reflected wave that's bounced back off again, of feeling and seeing the chop that lets you know you're in the wake of an island 50 miles back that way. Detecting the minute differences in what to the untutored eye looks no more meaningful than a washing machine cycle. Detecting that allows a remetto, a person of the sea in Marshallese, a remetto to determine where the nearest solid ground is and how far off it lies, long, long before it's visible. Which is to say, though it was nearly lost when US nuclear tests made the last of the wave pilot islands uninhabitable, there is a traditional Marshallese practice of training navigators not to look at stars or sun, but to feel in their bodies the tiny, regular sensations of reflected waves that have bounced off of distant islands. To feel among all the other waves in the ocean, among the wind and the sensations of your body and movement and chaos, the slow and almost imperceptible beat underneath all of that of a wave bouncing off cliffs and beach. In 2012, two physicists looking for dark energy and the Higgs boson heard about remettos, heard about these people who'd learned how to do with their bodies what the physicists were trying to do mathematically and experimentally, trying to find a subtle wave underneath all the chaos and noise of the universe. So these guys went to the Marshalls and they talked and they traveled at length with a remetto whose grandfather had taught him how to feel the backbone wave, the foundation wave that ran in between these two parallel lines of atolls, ran between it like a road. He said his grandfather had taught him to feel this wave by taking him to a reef and laying him down on his back in a canoe, blindfolded, and then dragging him around among the coral to feel in his body the different sensations of the waves bouncing underneath, until bit by bit he came to feel it. Perhaps then, in every ocean, sailors travel invisible roads with a guidepost that leads back to every island, every atoll, every rock, a thread that can lead them home to safety through the maze of the ocean. A compass so subtle and so quiet that no one but the wave pilots found it because no one knew where to look. The Quaker author Parker Palmer writes that there was a time when farmers on the Great Plains, at the first sign of a blizzard, would run a rope from the back door out to the barn. They all knew stories of people who'd wandered off and been frozen to death, having lost sight of home in a whiteout while still in their backyards. Today, says Parker Palmer, today we live in a blizzard of another sort. It swirls around us as economic injustice and ecological ruin, as physical and spiritual violence and their inevitable outcome, war. It swirls within us as fear and frenzy, greed and deceit, and indifference to the suffering of others. We all know stories of people who have wandered off into this madness and been separated from their own souls, losing their moral bearings. And they make headlines because they take so many people down with them. Lost ones come from every walk of life: clergy and corporate executives, politicians, people on the street, celebrities, school children. Some of us fear that we or those we love will be lost in that storm. And some of us are lost at this moment, trying to find the way home. Some of us are lost without knowing it. And the church at its best is a home in the storm. It's a whiteout out there, and so we take a rope out into the dangerous chaos so we can find our way back again. We're all going to get lost. We will all fall short. Every one of us, we will all fall short of our own hopes of integrity. But when we have the rope, we can find our way home. That's what the word religion means at its roots. One meaning, religio, the ties that bind one to another, to our ideals, to our resolve. and we stay connected because we know the storm can be more than we bear alone. In 2006, an increasingly long time ago, my wife and I finished seminary in Boston, and we moved out to Minnesota, Terry and I. She to do an internship at a Unitarian church in St. Paul, and I went to work at Target's headquarters out in Minneapolis. I worked in HR, I did learning and development for the income, for the health insurance. And for a while, certainly as I was getting the job, as we were moving out there for the first few months, for a while, that job was just sort of a placeholder. That was a thing to do until Terry finished her work and I went on to my internship and kept moving towards ministry. My destination was clear, the path was obvious. That's foreshadowing. In that first year, I was wrapped up in the work of the place. There were always interesting people to work with and interesting problems to solve. And there was travel and big budgets and my own ambition, which I had not even known was there. I got in touch with this secret type A side of myself that I never admitted to myself. My whole life I had said, you don't have to compete, just win. Yeah, that is tight. But the work was full and it was busy. And there was always one more project and one more deadline. Do y'all know about leveling up? It's like you're playing a video game and there's one more item to collect, there's one more side quest to solve, there's one more boss to beat, and chasing this one after another, you fall into the game and then you realize you should have gone to bed like 4 hours ago. Yeah, some of you know. And my destination, my plan, ministry, this was there, but it was obscured by the sort of whiteout of a storm of busy meeting schedules and deadlines and project plans, so many spreadsheets. And there I was, incredibly lucky, just dumb lucky to know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And discovering firsthand the blizzard that keeps you from moving towards it. And I'm not saying you can't work a job and keep your soul. I'm saying for me in that moment, what was happening for me was this distance growing between my insides and my outsides, right? This distance between a sense of who I wanted to be and who I actually was practicing becoming in the world every day. You probably know that feeling too. I was walking to the bus one day after work on a spring afternoon, and I heard a song that I had listened to 100 times before. But in that moment of chance or grace, I don't know the difference, the gap between the inner life and the outer life all of a sudden was visible to me again. I was 9 months into the job. I was leveling up steadily, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is not what I am in Minnesota to do. Which is not fundamentally about a call to ministry. This is not a story about me at all. This is a call to all of us. In different ways and shapes and times, a call to live an undivided life. Not to separate self from soul in this swirling storm of the world. And you've had these experiences too, right? Maybe in earth-shaking encounters with the holy, maybe in that little scrap of music that reminds you, oh, wait a minute. Maybe in prayer or meditation, maybe working in the garden, maybe listening to a dear friend share their life, maybe lighting candles, maybe marching in the street. You've been called home to yourself time and again in this life. There's a thread you follow writes the poet William Stafford. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread because it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die. You suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. What is that thread for you, which guides you safe through the maze of the world? What is that thread? How do you find it? After Minnesota, and before moving out here 2 summers ago, Terry and I served a Unitarian church in Chicago that was built as a miniature Gothic cathedral in the 1920s. It was 50 feet tall and 100 feet long and 25 feet wide. And it was beautiful, and it was a terrible building to have church in. You were very wise to build this instead. Because you're like you're in an airplane, you know? The closest person to me when I preached was about like where you guys are sitting back there right now. It was beautiful and difficult, but that's not the story. The story is on the front facade of this church, way up high, just below where the roof comes together in that tall point on the outside, was the symbol of a cross inside an astrolabe. So a cross, because they were Christian Unitarians in the 20s when they built the place, but an astrolabe, how many of you know what an astrolabe is? All right, there were like 6 hands, and that was a much higher proportion than I expected. So astrolabes are like a GPS of the ancient world. They were invented by the classical Greeks, and they were used throughout the Mediterranean and Islamic world for 1,500 years. So an astrolabe is a flat circle with an elaborate set of measurements on it, and then a second arc of metal perpendicular to the first one. And what you do is you hold this thing flat to the horizon. Say you're out at sea, right? You hold it level to the horizon, and then you take the measurement, you take the angle of a fixed point at a fixed time. So like the sun at noon, what's the angle of the sun at noon? If you're on the equator, of course, the sun at noon is going to be directly overhead. But if you're up here or anywhere that's not the equator, depending on the time of year, you've got to do a little bit of calculating. But if you know the time of year and you know the angle of the sun overhead, you know how far north or south you are compared to the equator. So you don't know how far east or west you are, but at least you know how far north or south you are, and you can do a lot of navigating that way. Thank you for coming to this episode of Preachers Explain Old Inventions. The people who built that church in the 20s didn't put the astrolabe in the most prominent position of the facade just because it's a clever discovery. It's there as a reminder that through all the storms and the chaos of life, through the world where things are complex and complicated and volatile and uncertain, we have tools to find our way home. If you're lost at sea, you can reorient your life to a larger reality. You can find your position by looking at the sun and stars, by finding those things that don't change, even as everything around them changes. You have tools to point you on the way. And look, like using an astrolabe, you don't automatically know where you are all the time. It requires a quality of attention and focus and discernment is what this is in traditional language, to figure out where you are and where you're trying to get to. That's what we're doing. That's what you do in this house week after week. Practice paying attention in the quiet stillness of this place so that we can go out into the storm and practice it there too. We quiet our bodies and our minds to listen to the still small voice of conscience, whose story is so simple and gentle as to be entirely missed in the noise of living, whose invitation is to grow your spirit and help to heal the world. And then the work of your whole life gets to be figuring out, what does that actually mean for you? And how do you choose to do it over and over and over again? That's practice. It's what you do singing, you practice that. It's what you do in the stones in a few minutes, you practice that. It's what you do greeting each other warmly in the morning, you practice that. A constant choosing of what story are we going to belong to. The folk singer Pete Seeger tells the story of seeing, in the early days of the Vietnam War, a lone Quaker protester late one night in the dark holding a sign on a corner, entirely ignored by the world walking by. And he asks this guy, what are you doing? What is changing? What is the point of this? How are you going to change the world with one sign on an empty corner? And the young man paused and straightened and said, I am here to make sure the world does not change me. That's the work we're doing here. It's paying attention to who are you becoming, and are you choosing it? Will we listen with our whole bodies, with every bit of ourselves, our spirits, to feel for that wave hidden underneath the noise of the world, the one which points to safe harbor? It's practice. It's practice. And in that sense, in that frame, worship, this thing we do on Sunday morning, it's not something done for you, it's something done by you. It's active. Y'all are working at least as hard as me right now. We come to church to listen, and I don't just mean to the preacher or the musicians. We come to church to listen, to practice it, finding that still small voice of conscience, of compassion, of love, that call of love, which is like a lighthouse steering us safe through darkness, which we hear in each other, voices of wisdom and experience, of difference and diversity, voices of human beings with the same fear, compassion, and pain. We come to church to listen to the holy, the voice of all being, of life itself, whatever that larger love is that holds us. I'm so much less interested in the name than the experience of looking for and finding that thing. We tend to our interior life exactly so that we can live in the world and help each other heal it. And we come into this house to sing and pray and learn and tell stories and fellowship and drink coffee and raise money and take out the garbage and change the light bulbs. I mean, we do all of this stuff to invest our lives into each other as a community, to create something, to weave the real substance of the congregation, which is that relationship and that shared seeking. There is no consoling certainty in this work. Tragedies happen. People get old and die. It stinks. And that's what we signed up for in living, too. Out on the open sea, you can't feel what the island will be like when you arrive there, what life you'll have when you follow that thread. You don't know who it is exactly. You'll become who you're becoming. You can only listen with your whole body and spirit. Listen through the chaos of the ocean for the hidden wave that's going to guide you to solid life. That's the life you're invited into, and I have no idea where that will take you. But I know that it won't steer you wrong. I heard a Norwegian fairy tale in which the hero comes to a crossroads and 3 paths lie ahead, and each is labeled handily, because it's a fairy tale, with what's going to happen if you follow that road. And one path is marked, travel down this road, and you'll return to this place unharmed. And the second path is marked, travel down this road, and you may or may not return. And the third is marked, travel down this road, and you will never return. And of course, in the fairy tale, our hero chooses the third path, never to return. How else can you discover the outcome of your journey unless it leads to a place and a person you have not yet been? That's what we're doing. Practicing, paying attention, listening for the backbone wave underneath all the noise, the wave that points to solid ground, the road that leads you home, the thread you follow. We listen and we choose it over and over again, following love's lead. Amen.